Hey students, I hope you're all having a great day today. My name is Torres and I want to take a moment to thank you for joining me for a little Psych 101. In this video, we will learn about major figures and how various approaches to psychology were developed. This video has two overarching ideas. First, psychology is a social science that studies mental processing and behavior. And second, psychology employs several different major theoretical perspectives and/or subfields. This video will focus on the vocabulary on this slide. You can find this information in the Torres Psych 101 Google slide deck and also in the Torres Psych 101 Key Vocab Google Doc. Both of these files are linked in the description box below. Let's start by looking at the word psychology. The word psychology comes from the root words psyche and ology. The prefix psyche derives from the mythology of Psyche. In Greek mythology, she was the goddess of soul. The ology means the scientific study of. Thus, together, the word translates to the study of the soul. Specifically, psychology is the scientific study of how people think, believe, and feel. Psychologists study everything about the human experience, from the basic workings of the human brain to consciousness, memory, language, reasoning, to personality and mental health. Psychology did not emerge as its own discipline until the late 1800s. In fact, for hundreds of years, psychology was closely tied to philosophy. The earliest history can be traced back to the early Greeks and also in the 17th century with French philosopher René Descartes. It was in the late 1800s when the separation of the two disciplines became more clear. It was believed that philosophers relied on methods such as observation and logic, and psychologists were starting to use the scientific process to study human thought and behavior. By looking at this timeline, you can see that there have been steady contributions to the field of psychology since 1879. I want to start off by pointing out some major figures and how their approaches are related to their ideas. There are several major psychologists, mostly men, that made contributions to our understanding of the human mind and behavior, especially throughout the past 2 centuries. Though some of these theories are now controversial, they all had a profound impact in the field of psychology. The father of psychology is considered to be WILHELM WUNDT. WUNDT used introspection to invest the human mind. Introspection comes from Latin that means looking up. It is a type of experimental self-observation. Basically, participants were asked to reflect on their own cognitive processes and describe them. In other words, they would describe what they were thinking. Wundt established psychology as a science because he used the scientific method to study how people thought. His ideas would lead to multiple different psychological perspectives. Edward TITCHENER expanded on Wundt's teaching. He called his system structuralism. Structuralism is a theory of consciousness that seeks to analyze the elements of mental experiences, such as sensations, mental images, and feelings, and how these elements combine to form more complex experiences. Structuralism used controlled methods such as introspection to break down consciousness to its basic elements without sacrificing any of the properties of the whole. Titchener proposed 3 elementary stages of consciousness: sensations, which are sights, sounds, and tastes; images, which are components of thoughts; and affections, components of emotions. G. Stanley Hall was the first to receive a PhD based on psychological research, and he was the first chair in the new field of psychology in the country. Hall was a major force in organizing the field of psychology. He focused on scientific approaches and established a psychology laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. He launched the first American Journal of Psychology, and he convened the American Psychological Association and served as the first president. He developed his influential concept of genetic psychology based on evolutionary theory and solidified his reputation as a leading educational reformer. Throughout his career, Hall took on a variety of issues and synthesized scholarship from a wide range of disciplines like genetics, health, and sociology. For a quick second, I wanted to sort of veer off psychology information and talk a little bit about Charles Darwin, who was an explorer and a biologist. Charles Darwin proposed the idea of natural selection. Natural selection is when physical traits that aid one species to survive are passed on from generation to generation. His research focused on evolution's impact on genes. Genes result in characteristics and behaviors that are useful and adaptive. At one point, psychologists began to integrate these ideas into their theories and began to assume that behavior and mental processes are also the result of evolution. For example, aggression might be a form of territorial protection. A psychologist who was influenced heavily by Darwinism was William James. William James established functionalism by drawing from the functionality of cognitive processes. Functionalism emphasized how mental activities contribute to basic environmental survival. Functional psychology, or functionalism, refers to a psychological philosophy that considers mental life and behavior in terms of active adaptation to the person's environment. As such, it provides the general basis for developing psychological theories not readily testable by controlled experiments, and for applied psychology. Max Wertheimer was one of the key figures that formed Gestalt psychology, in part as a response to the structuralism of Wilhelm WUNDT. The word Gestalt comes from the German language and does not have a direct equivalent in English. However, it generally translates to the way things are placed or put together as a whole. In the field of psychology, Gestalt is most accurately described as a pattern or configuration. In this context, Gestalt encompasses the human mind and behavior as a whole. While followers of structuralism were interested in breaking down psychological matters into their smallest possible parts, Gestalt psychologists wanted instead to look at the totality of the mind and behavior. Guided by the principle of holism, Wertheimer and his followers identified instances where perception was based on seeing things as a complete whole, not as their separate components. One type of psychology you may already be aware of is psychodynamic psychology. Psychodynamic psychology is the branch of psychology with a focus of underlying factors that affect the behavior of a person, especially the subconscious mind. The premise of this approach is choices and behaviors are affected by current and past experiences and the subconscious reaction to these experiences. In other words, behavior and mental process reflect an unconscious struggle. As humans, we struggle between unconscious desires and the need to follow rules. The founder of psychoanalytic theory is Sigmund Freud. Psychoanalytic theory is a perspective which dominated clinical psychology for many decades. Maybe in some movie you noticed that there was a psychologist sitting behind a patient lying on a couch. This is a typical psychoanalytic scenario. Sigmund Freud studied hysteria and neurosis. He theorized that many of his patients' problems arose from the unconscious mind, and he believed that one way the unconscious mind could be accessed was through dream analysis. He believed that by focusing on the role of a person's unconscious and early childhood experiences, they could overcome any mental issues. Another way to view psychology was the behaviorist approach. Behaviorists focus on observable behavior and how behavior is learned. They believe humans learn behaviors through conditioning, which associates stimulus in the environment, like a sound, to a response, such as what a human does when they hear that sound. The father of behaviorism is John B. Watson. Watson believed that objective analysis of the mind was impossible. Instead, he focused on observable behavior and ways to bring that behavior under control. Today, behaviorism is used in behavioral and cognitive behavioral therapy to change people's actions. A major figure in behaviorist psychology was Ivan Petrovich Pavlov. As a behaviorist, Pavlov focused on investigating exactly how responses are learned or acquired. In a series of experiments, he set out to provoke a conditioned response to a previously neutral stimulus. He opted to use food as the unconditioned stimulus, or the stimulus that evokes the response naturally and automatically. When animals get hungry, they salivate. Pavlov began to notice that the dogs were beginning to salivate as a response to seeing the research assistant's white lab coats. Unlike the salivary response to the presentation of food, which is an unconditioned reflex, the dogs began to salivate when they saw the white lab coat. He called this type of conditioning classical conditioning. Pavlov's experiments with his dogs, which led to the theory of classical conditioning, is one of the most famous psychological experiments of all time. Unlike Pavlov, which focused on a person's reaction to stimuli, B.F. Skinner investigated the effect of rewards and consequences on behavior. Skinner's ideas were based on previous psychological theories of law and effect by Thorndike. According to this idea, behavior that is followed by pleasant consequences are likely to be repeated, while behavior that's followed by unpleasant consequences is less likely to be repeated. Through reinforcement, which is either reinforced through positive rewards or negative consequences, he began to experiment using lab rats, in which he placed into a Skinner box. The Skinner box would record an animal's behavior during a specific time frame. The animal would be rewarded when it engaged in the desired behavior, such as pressing a lever. For example, if the rat pressed a lever, it would get a piece of food. Receiving that reward ensured that the rat would continue to press the lever over and over. When a response or behavior is strengthened by a reward, it's called positive reinforcement. If a behavior is diminished because of a punishment, it's called negative reinforcement. Humanistic psychology was developed in response to psychoanalytic and behaviorist psychology. This area looks at the person as a whole and their unique experiences. It is premised on the assumption that people have free will and people want to achieve their highest potential. The humanistic approach in psychology developed as a rebellion against what some psychologists saw as the limitations of the behaviorist and psychodynamic psychology. A well-known humanistic psychologist was Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers developed a client-centered therapy method that has been influential in clinical settings to this day. Client-centered therapy involves the patient taking a lead role in the therapy session. Rogers believed that therapists needed to have an unconditional positive regard for their patients, they had to be genuine, and they had to conduct themselves with great empathy. Rogers' theory of personality development was based on humanistic psychology. According to his approach, everyone exists in a world full of experiences. Unlike Freud, who believed that our reactions are tied to the unconscious experiences, Carl Rogers believed that our reactions are tied to conscious experiences. These experiences shape our reactions that include external objects and people, also internal thoughts and emotions. This is known as their phenomenal field. Abraham Maslow was another humanistic psychologist who was concerned with levels of human motivation. He believed that motivation was influenced by the extent basic needs are met. Human choice is therefore governed by how well these needs are met. To demonstrate his ideas, he developed a hierarchy of needs to explain human motivation. His theory suggested that people have a number of basic needs that must be met before people can move up the hierarchy to pursue more social, emotional, and self-actualizing needs. Sociocultural psychology combines two major fields of social science. It combines social psychology, which studies groups, social roles, and rules of social action, and cultural psychology, which studies cultural norms, values, and expectations. In essence, It studies the effect that people have on each other, whether it is an individual interaction or whether it's an interaction between large groups. Examples of these types of interactions include prejudice, values, beliefs, attraction, interpersonal conflicts, obedience, social roles, and other social dynamics that influence free will and choice. A major player in social cultural psychology is Stanley MILGRAM. He was interested in studying power dynamics between individuals and figures of authority. His research demonstrated how far people are willing to go to obey authority, even if the demands contradict their own beliefs or ethics. His now infamous obedience experiments asked participants to give an electric shock to subjects that did not remember the correct relationships between words. Unbeknownst to the participants, they were not actually shocking the subjects being tested. They were simply instructed to administer the shock to the subjects. Even when they protested, many of the participants continued to shock the innocent subjects, although they had done nothing wrong. Stanley MILGRAM's experiments are remembered for the ethical issues and their contributions to changes in how experiments can be conducted today. Philip ZIMBARDO is another famous sociocultural psychologist that also studied power dynamics between individuals and groups. He studied how people can be transformed in certain group or power situations to make decisions they would not make under other circumstances. As a professor of psychology at Stanford, he is best known for his work on the Stanford prison experiment. This experiment demonstrated the power of social situations through a mock prison experiment with normal, healthy college students. One set of students were pre-assigned to become the prisoners in the experiment, and the other group were selected to become the guards of the prison in the experiment. As the experiment continued, the students that acted as prison guards began to abuse power to the point that the students that had assumed the prisoner role had begun to break down. Biological psychology, or biopsychological psychology, applies the principles of anatomy, physiology, chemicals, and genetics to the study of behavior. The structure and function of the biological components of the body are tied to a person's reaction rather than their environment. Biological psychologists think of behavior and mental processes as being shaped by the biological process happening in a person's body. They study the effects of hormones, genes, and the activity of the nervous system. For example, they might examine brain activity by using brain scans when examining thinking, or looking at mental illness treatments using medication. Biological psychologists are highly influential in today's medical world. Somewhat related, but still very different, is biopsychosocial psychology. Biopsychosocial psychology is an integrated viewpoint that incorporates various levels of analysis and offers a more complete picture of any given behavior or mental process. It investigates how psychological and social factors influence the development of disease. The biopsychosocial model served as an incentive for many studies of how psychological and social factors influence the development, course, and outcome of a disease, such as cancer, high blood pressure, mental illness, and the body's ability to ward off disease. It has given rise to the development of an interdisciplinary field, particularly the fields of health psychology and psychoneuroimmunology. So let's take one more look at the overarching ideas. In today's video, we learned that psychology is a social science that studies mental processing and behavior. Psychology employs several different major theoretical perspectives and/or subfields. Before we say goodbye, for reflection, please take a few moments to consider the following open-ended question. How have philosophical perspectives and theoretical approaches shaped the field of psychology? I'd love to get your thoughts in the comments below. That's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we'll discuss different types of careers that use psychological concepts. Before you go, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Stats with Torres for more Psych 101. Looking forward to it. Ciao!